Does anybody really know what time it is? Does anybody really care? If so, I can't imagine why.
So this is part 2 of our lectures for this week. And now we're going to dive into the art and architecture of late antiquity. As you can see, chapter 7 is still what you need to have read for this lecture, so you're good. But in this particular lecture, you're really going to see what I was talking about at the beginning of the last one, where you're going to see me go through at least a couple of wardrobe changes, because I'm cobbling this lecture together from bits and pieces of other lectures that were specifically about the Middle Ages, but this bit about the late antiquity was in this one, a little bit from late antiquity was in this lecture, and so on, and I'm putting them together to form into this one. All right, just so you understand where we're getting into, or what you're getting into. Okay, all right. So without further ado, let's jump right into the art and architecture of late antiquity. All right. So late antiquity. Let's begin there. If you'll recall our conversation from last week, late antiquity is that period of time that sort of has been sort of divided into its own period of time that is sort of a bridge between ancient Rome and the Middle Ages in Europe. We're going to look specifically at this period of time at early Christian art and architecture. The Romans are still around and still doing their thing during late antiquity, though the Roman Empire is falling. But we're going to specifically look at Christian art and architecture of the time. So early Christian art of this period. And understand, again, there would have been Christian art in the places where it began, in ancient Israel, ancient Palestine, that region, as well as a lot of art in the eastern half of the empire. But we're going to particularly look at, well, I guess we'll get into some of the stuff in the eastern half of the empire at this time, but we're mainly going to look at early Christian art in Rome proper, the city of Rome. We'll look at the catacombs, we'll look at some of the early iconography, and and we'll look at a sarcophagus in particular. So the catacombs. They were these burial corridors and chambers that were underground in Rome, as well as under other cities. But we're specifically going to talk about the ones in Rome. And by the late 2nd century, Christian symbols began to appearing on these walls. The earliest of these would have been people who were Christians in hiding. And as such, the art sort of is coded to protect them. By the 4th century, as Christianity was legalized, and then eventually triumphed in Rome, these symbols we start seeing these symbols more often in the catacombs, and they become less coded and more figurative. You'll see what I mean as we get into these. The earliest of symbols that we see down in the catacombs are very symbolic. And this is because, again, Christian citizens who could be buried in the catacombs, because understand you had to be a citizen to be buried down there, no longer had to hide their religion. They could make that public. So again, the catacombs, they are these dark corridors, as you can see, that were dug beneath the city of Rome, but have been used for a long time at this point as burial chambers. Again, you had to be a Roman citizen to be buried down here. And so, as I mentioned, some early Christians in Rome start to place symbols on their sarcophagi, on their family plots in the catacombs to designate themselves as Christian. But there were a lot of early Christians who had an aversion to figurative representations of Christ, meaning we don't want a representation of Christ that looks like a person. That seems strange because these days there seems to be no problem at all with depictions of Jesus, right? We don't seem to have a problem with that in art, but early on in Christianity, it felt wrong to a lot of them. And so symbols were used instead. It was also a way of coding the information to let fellow Christians know that you were a Christian without being faced with persecution. Or in the case of in the catacombs, right? Here you've been buried, right? You're dead. You're not going to be persecuted. But if you put some sort of Christian iconography onto your tomb that could be read by an outsider could see that and understand, oh, this person's Christian, then your family could potentially suffer persecution. So symbols were used instead. And this symbol, it says here, a Christ monogram in a wreath, but that symbol that you see there inside the wreath is what we call the Chi Rho. It's a common icon that we see at the time in late antiquity. And it's a visual symbol to represent Christ. And for a long time, this was the symbol that we saw rather than the cross. The cross, which is the symbol of Christianity worldwide now, it actually took a while for that to become the actual symbol of the religion. Because again, the cross itself represents the death of Christ. It's the thing that he died on. And so many early followers didn't want to celebrate that necessarily. It was seen as a somber, sad moment. And so for a lot of early Christendom, it was the Chi Rho. Now, what is the Chi Rho? Well, Christ, the name Christ, when written in Greek, using the Greek alphabet, is spelled as you see here. The first two letters of which are Chi and Rho. Right? What we would see as an X and a P in the modern day English alphabet. Right? Combine those together into this symbol right here, and you get the Chi Rho. Right? It is a symbol, a visual symbol for Christ. And again, as we just saw, it would often be placed on tombs and things of that nature to denote that you yourself had been a Christian in life. But again, it was symbolic, and so other Christians, if they saw it, would recognize it. But those who would be outside of the religion might not necessarily recognize it. So you could then save your family from any sort of persecution after your death. But you also see in this image of the Chi Rho, we also have, let me get my laser pointer, the Alpha and the Omega. That also, right, those are Greek letters, again, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. But again, in the Bible, Christ refers to himself by saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega. So putting those symbols on there might not necessarily immediately mean anything to someone outside the religion, but for those who would be Christian themselves, they would recognize that's also a symbol of Christ, Alpha and Omega. Now, some of the earliest paintings down, frescoes, for those who were buried in the catacombs who were Christian. Some of these early paintings start to become figural. This in particular is a fresco painting on the ceiling of a catacomb chamber of a Christian. The Christian would have been Priscilla, as mentioned there in the description in the corner. it presents a figurative, though still symbolic, representation of Christ, specifically here as the Good Shepherd. Now, interestingly, Christ, the depictions of Jesus, depictions of Christ, didn't develop the sort of bearded character that we know of now early on. A lot of representations of Jesus early on often show him as a young man, like this person here, and he's presented as a shepherd. Now, this is to be symbolic of his own story of I am the good shepherd, the good shepherd story, the allegorical ways that story explains how Jesus wants his followers to understand their role toward him and what his role is toward them, that kind of thing, right? And so putting a shepherd on the ceiling wouldn't necessarily, if I've painted a fresco of a shepherd on my tomb, that's not necessarily going to alert anyone who sees it that there is someone who is practicing an illegal religion, right? This is painted in this almost impressionistic style, right? There's very simple brush strokes. Not a lot of attention to detail has been paid. And we know that a lot of Roman artists did pay a lot of attention to detail in their frescoes and paintings. It seems to have been done very quickly, right? And again, as I say, you need to be in the know to see this and understand it. To anyone else, right, outside of the Christian faith, seeing this, it would seem like it's just a simple painting of a shepherd, or in sort of Roman symbolism, a shepherd could just represent something as simple as a leader or a king, or maybe even a philosopher or a teacher. So this wouldn't have seemed like anything worth worrying about, right? And it wouldn't have cast suspicion on your family. But it's certainly braver than this, right? Here we have this sarcophagus of a man by the name of Junius Bassus. That this would have been made for him to be buried sometime after 359. It's the sarcophagus in which Junius was buried. And by this point, Christianity has been legalized, and Roman citizens who were Christians didn't have to worry, and so became much more brave, if you will, with decorating their sarcophagi with figurative, much more overt Judeo-Christian imagery. This sarcophagus is covered with, like high relief sculptures. These are relief sculptures, but they're high relief sculptures that portray specific scenes from the New and Old Testaments, like, down here, there's Adam and Eve, right? Here's Zacchaeus climbing the tree just to see Jesus. There are Judeo-Christian stories, right, that have no link to to Roman mythology. Up here at the top, let's get a closer look at that. We have a representation of Christ enthroned. He's sitting on a throne here, with Peter on one side and Paul on the other. Sorry, my phone moved as I tried to move my laser pointer. And again, Christ isn't shown yet with that beard that we're all so familiar with. That would have been the custom at this time. He wasn't portrayed as having a beard yet. But there's still this juxtaposition, however, of Christian and pagan, imagery. Christian imagery and imagery from the Roman and Greek empires. For one, Jesus, as it has been pictured here, he's been depicted here very much like a Greek philosopher would have been, right? He's seated, he's teaching with his hands in this sort of gesture that's very reminiscent of how the Greek philosophers would have taught. And in addition to that, I did not mean to do that. In addition to that, down here below, we seem to have a Roman sky god who is holding up heaven. That's an interesting choice to have something like that in what is now a Christian image. But also there's this interesting little detail that Christ's foot is just stepping over the edge, kind of pushing down on him, which seems to be indicative of Christ's triumphs over these pagan gods. And of course, now you're going to hear me use that word pagan a lot. Pagan is a term that once the church is in control in the Middle Ages, pagan is what they sort of label everything that all of the different religions and practices and customs that predate Christianity in Europe. Right? They start to label that stuff as pagan and needing to be stamped out and gotten rid of. Right? And here we have a sort of an early representation of that way of thinking. Just for the fun of it, I thought we would also take a look at Ambrosian chant. This is something that comes along during late antiquity. Over here we have a mosaic of Saint Ambrose or Ambrosius, as he's listed there, because that would have been his name in Latin. He developed what is known as Ambrosian hymn or Ambrosian chant. This was a type of chant in the early Christian church that took a lot of its themes, a lot of its inspiration from Roman chant, but Ambrose also was looking at music coming out of the Middle East. And combine them into liturgical music that would follow the Christian calendar and would have a sort of call and response where there would be a voice that would sing a stanza, or one half of the congregation singing a stanza, and then either the entire congregation or the other half of the congregation singing a response back. It is completely what we call monophonic, meaning that there is one melody without an accompanying harmony or chords. Right, so everybody's singing one note together. And as I say, there's sort of a call and response. There's going to be someone singing a part and then others answering that part back and forth. We'll play a small portion of it. I'll try to remember to also, in the material, post a link to this music itself, just in case YouTube dings me for any copyright things. We'll play a little bit of it here. So as I say, it took influences both from Roman chant, types of chanting that would have been done during Roman religious services, as well as reaching back to the Middle East and pulling in some of the sort of Judeo influences into this type of chant as well. And Ambrosian chant, Saint Ambrose, specifically came from. He lived in Milan, Italy, in the 5th century, and so this type of chant is very specifically connected to Milan specifically. It did spread outward, but it would kind of be overtaken by a different kind of chant that we'll get to later on, a few centuries down the line. And now is very localized to Milan, and interestingly enough, Ireland. There's a lot of Ambrosian chant in Ireland when it comes to Catholic mass and liturgical music and things of that nature. All right. If we look at the architecture of late antiquity, and specifically we're going to look at the Roman basilica. Okay, so the basilica was a type of building that was already in existence in ancient Rome. It was a Roman civic meeting building. These were for civic meetings, right? Like think like your community center in your community, right? Places where you get together to do things as a community. Places where you might go, in the case of the Roman basilica, you might go there to hear announcements from your local government. There may be events that would be held there, things of that nature, right? So it was a civic meeting building. These were already in existence. And so when Christianity began to rise up within the Roman Empire, existing basilicas got converted to Christian purposes. And then, once Christianity triumphed, the basilica design became the model for new places of worship, right? So as new churches were being built, they were built as basilicas. So what does a basilica look like? And this is important because even if you don't attend a Catholic church of any sort, if you attend any sort of a Christian church, and again, if you don't, no judgments, as I said last week, you owe much of the design of that church that you go to the Roman basilica. Elements of the basilica have stuck around even in the backwater country church, right? There are elements of this that have been passed down and passed down and passed down, and we still retain today. So basilica. This over here to the left is the floor plan of the old St. Peter's Basilica. We'll talk about that in depth in a moment. So the architectural elements that define a basilica. It was cruciform in shape. That means it was shaped like a cross, right? Like here's this part, and then there's a beam that crosses it here. It was already shaped like a cross, right? Which makes sense why Christians were attracted to it. Right, that was already built into the Roman design. So there's like a central rectangular hall that then gets divided up by rows of columns into what are referred to as the nave. That's this big central portion right here. And this is where people would have I was about to say where they would have sat, but no, there was no seating in a basilica. You stood for worship. But this is where the worshipers would stand, right? And the aisles. The aisles are these portions on either side, right? And what you see is these little sort of dotted lines. These are all the columns that would have divided up the aisles from the nave, right? This big central rectangular portion. Then on the eastern end, because basilicas and therefore the churches that were built after them were built on an east-west axis, right? So the front of the basilica where you would enter, right, is the western side. Unfortunately, this has been turned the wrong way. This particular but if I turned it the other way, all of the text would have been backwards, so I didn't flip it. The eastern side has what's referred to as the apse. The apse, The apse is where the altar would have been, as you see here. Right, this is where the priest would give the homily, where mass would be done, where communion would have been served. All of that happens in the apse. Then there's the transept, and that's this perpendicular hall that runs, well, perpendicular to the central hall. It's the part that makes the whole thing into a cruciform shape. Sometimes there would be an exterior atrium. That's this portion out here, but not always, right? An atrium or a courtyard, but not all basilicas would have that. And that would also be lined with columns. The Greek and Roman columns would continue well into early Christendom. All right, so this is a cross-section, an artist reconstruction of the Basilica Ulpia, which does not exist, that would have been built in 112 CE. So this would have been a meeting hall that was not designed for Christian purposes whatsoever, right? And we see the design of it. There's that central nave. Here are aisles to the sides, divided off by all these columns. Down there at the end would have been the apse. And we see, represented by this bit of building that we can see here and over here, the transept that crosses this whole thing, right? It's all built on a cross. Right? And then there was this upper portion as well. There was this upper portion here, right, that really didn't serve much of a purpose. No one could go up there. It was just giving the whole thing height. Well, as you can see, the St. Peter's Basilica, here it's called the Old St. Peter's Basilica because this has been destroyed. It was destroyed and built over, but we'll talk about that later. It would have been built somewhere in the 1330s or the 330s or the 340s. And it was commissioned by Constantine, or either by Constantine or one of his immediate successors, to be built in Rome over the spot where tradition says Saint Peter, who founded the church in Rome, was buried after his martyrdom. The tradition says he was martyred by the Romans. Crucified him as well, but they did so by turning the cross upside down, so he was crucified with his head pointing downward. But as you can see, it's built on a Roman basilica model. It became the center of Catholicism and Western Christianity as a whole, which is why to this day it's referred to as Roman Catholicism. Right? This was the seat of the church, St. Peter's Basilica. For centuries, it attracted international pilgrims from all over Europe and eventually even farther out. But it was dismantled in the 17th century, so like the 1600s, and replaced by the newer St. Peter's Basilica that still stands to this day. So we only have drawings, paintings, architectural designs, and things of that nature of it. But again, take a cross section of the interior of the old St. Peter's, which is here on the right, compare it to the old Roman Basilica design from a couple centuries before it, there on the left, and you can see that the same architectural language was just repurposed in the case of the Christian basilica, right? We just very simply took a pre-existing Roman archetypal building and repurposed it as a place for Christian worship. St. Peter's Basilica was just one. It's not as if it was the only one. These were built all over Europe. And a few of them still stand. Let me move myself out of the way. There are a few of them that are still standing. I mean, these are very ancient buildings, so the fact that they're still standing is impressive. This is the Basilica of Santa Sabina. It would have been built in Rome in 432. We're looking at the eastern end, so this is the asp here on this end. We can see the central nave. The transept would be this little you can see this portion, and that portion gets repeated on the other side. That would be the transept that would have cut across. We can't see the front end of it from here. We go inside, and we can see inside exactly those architectural elements that we were talking about, right? Here's that central nave. Down here at the end would be the apse. The apse was usually built on sort of a half arch, so that it was rounded like this. And down here would be the altar. Right, the transept cuts in through this door that you can see right here, and on the other side, if we could just see the other side, there'd be a door there as well. That's where the transept cuts across this central nave. The nave, of course, is divided off, and there are aisles on either side that are separated from the central nave by these columns, which you'll note all have Corinthian capitals there. Right? And these Roman arches. It's not as if the language of Roman civic and architectural design just completely and utterly just like vanished overnight. It was still put to use, but it was put to use very specifically for Christian worship. But the Basilica of Santa Savina has one other particularly important distinction, and that is that on the main door, there are these, and this is made of wood, by the way. The main door, made of wood, has these panels that have been put into it. And these panels tell several biblical stories from both the Old and New Testament. And this one right here, you're going to recognize, right? This is looking a little bit more like the kind of Christian iconography that we see even now. We're getting much later into late antiquity. We're about to hit the Middle Ages proper. And you'll see that we have a Jesus here that looks a little more like the mature depiction of Jesus that we think of now, right? Little bit of a beard going on there. The hair is a bit longer. But you'll recall I said for a lot of early Christendom, we didn't see depictions of the cross. Well, not only are we seeing a depiction of a cross here, we are seeing a depiction of Jesus dying on the cross. And so this door, this particular crucifixion scene, has the distinction of being at least the oldest confirmed depiction of the crucifixion that we know of. That sounds like it might be important, something to write down. All right, this is at least there are others that try to claim that they are older than this, but this is the one that we have a definitive date for. So it's recognized right now as the oldest known depiction of Christ dying on the cross. Mosaics. You'll recall, as we mentioned in the lecture about Roman art, that mosaics, again, which are images produced by arranging small colored pieces of stone, tile, or glass, were extremely popular in Rome, right? And so it makes sense then that the earliest Romans to convert to Christianity would make a lot of their art as mosaics as well. And so in late antiquity, there are a lot of artists who begin incorporating Christian imagery into their mosaics. These Christian mosaics is that Christian and pagan elements coexist within them in the same way that we saw with that sarcophagus earlier. So this is I'll just leave myself over here. This is an excellent example of that. This is a vault mosaic that's inside the church of Santa Costanza in Rome that would have been made sometime between 337 and 354. And you look at this mosaic, and if it weren't in a Christian church, it might seem secular or related to Greek or Roman religious concerns with wine and olive oil. Right? You look at this and you don't necessarily see anything that immediately stands out as Christian. However, it is in a church, and so with it being in that context, it takes that pagan imagery, right? The imagery that would have been important to cultures that were not Christian, and converts it into a message that references the importance of, say, communion wine, of anointing one's head with oil. All these olives that we see point very heavily toward lots of olive imagery in the New Testament. Christ preached on the Mount of Olives, right? Things of that nature. We see canisters that would have been used for either holding oil or wine. This vase here would have been used for oil. This horn would have been used for drinking wine. This is a bowl that would have carried wine in it. And upon it, we see two doves, right? It is pretty early on in Christian iconography that the dove starts to take on religious significance as a symbol for the Holy Spirit. And there's the Holy Spirit hanging out with a bowl of wine, right? There's all sorts of indications that point toward communion and the importance of the wine and its connection to the blood of Christ and the salvation of humanity, right? But that's all hidden in codified imagery here, right? And here we have something much more figurative, something that's being less, or rather more overt and not trying to sort of hide behind symbols. This is a piece from the mausoleum of Gala Placidia, wow, in Ravenna, Italy. That would have been, this mosaic would have been made around 450. Here we see Christ is young. He's still beardless, right? We don't necessarily see that beard just yet. But there's far more overt Christian imagery happening here. For one, and this is something that we're going to see a whole lot of from here on out, is that halo around his head, right? The halo in Christian art becomes a means of denoting that the person that we're looking at is holy. And it becomes commonplace. It's going to get used all over the place. He's holding the cross in his left hand, right? That's no hiding that cross. It's right out there. It's gold. It's easy to see, right? We're not trying to hide the fact that we're Christian anymore. And with his right hand, he's feeding his sheep, his followers, right? All of this imagery comes straight out of the Good Shepherd stories that Jesus tells in the Bible. And I say stories because if you ever look, right, there are two versions. Luke has one, and I want to say either Mark or Matthew has a different version of the Good Shepherd story. Rather than decorating a tomb with a vision of the afterlife, right? Because think about just how many cultures we've seen do that, right? That have given us depictions of what they believed the afterlife was going to be in the tomb of the one who had died. Instead, this seems to be representing the hope and comfort of Christ taking care of his followers to those who are alive, who might be visiting this mausoleum, right? That's an interesting choice, right? There's not a depiction of Gaia here in heaven, right? Instead, we have a depiction of a story that was meant to be an allegory for how Christ looks after his followers. Byzantium was the eastern half of the empire, and it remained stable for centuries, as I've already mentioned in last week's lectures. And the Byzantines developed this artistic style that was very focused on translating church theology into artistic terms. The art was sort of seen as needing to conform to Christian theology, right? And it did so by communicating the divine nature of biblical figures and saints and present-day rulers. These would have been rulers that were believed to be holy. In these images that we refer to as icons. And icons were these sometimes small, sometimes they can be pretty large, religious images that were used for worship that we'll dive into more in depth in a moment. And there was this very distinctive visual styles that were developed in the Byzantine Empire that remained relatively unchanged for almost 1,000 years. And if in the Greek Orthodox Church, in the icon painters of the Greek Orthodox Church, this is still practiced to this day even. But once the Ottoman Empire moved in, the broader practice of it throughout Byzantium sort of ended. So what are the distinctive characteristics? How can you recognize that you're seeing Byzantine art? Well, you're going to see things like gold everywhere. The Byzantines would use gold leaf throughout their icons and paintings. This was meant, let me move this over here. This was meant to as a means of showing that the place in which this was a way of showing that the setting was not of this world, right? Oftentimes, gold leaf would be put into the background, into negative spaces, to create this sense that we are in heaven or we're in a place that can be that is incapable of being defined. We're going to see halos again. We saw it in the Western art, but we're going to see it much earlier in Byzantine art. Halos around the heads of very important or holy figures. And interestingly, Byzantine art is abstract, but not only is it abstract, it is anti-naturalistic, right? It's not as if these artists didn't know how to make art that looked naturalistic. They were very specifically going against that because it was the feeling in the Orthodox Christian Byzantine Empire that only God should do something like that. That is God's place, right? To make something naturalistic looking. So you're going to often see a flattened space, right? There won't be a sense of any sort of depth. There won't be any sense that these things are happening in a room or in a field or what have you, right? It's going to be a very flattened space. There's also what I refer to and what you'll see oftentimes referred to as the Byzantine face. Right? The Byzantine face is just this generic face with little to no expression that almost every single one of the Byzantine characters will have. Right? There's very little differentiation in the face to give them any sort of an individualized quality. Different characters will be differentiated from one another by very specific colors of clothing that they should be wearing, items that they should be holding, maybe by certain hairstyles or beard styles, things of that nature. You're not going to see them really differentiated by facial features. Not for the most part, at least. Then the Byzantines also had this tendency of very elegantly giving human proportions an elongated feel. You'll see long, skinny fingers. You'll see faces that seem sort of stretched. Bodies will be stretched out of proportion. Things of that nature. And it's done in this very sort of elegant manner. So here are some examples of some icons here. Right? These are from different periods throughout this 1,000-year reign of the Byzantine Empire. An icon, again, is a painting of a holy figure done in the traditional style on wood and then venerated by people of Eastern Orthodoxy churches during the Byzantine Empire and in Greek Orthodox churches to this day. And it would be a devotional aid. Many Greek Orthodox practitioners will be encouraged to pray to the saint depicted in the icon, so that saint can then go and speak to God on your behalf. And it's an important little tidbit of information to know that St. Luke is traditionally considered the first icon painter. Right? St. Luke, who wrote the Gospel according to Luke and wrote the book of the Acts of the Apostles, right? He's also considered the first icon painter, and that's important because he's also going to, as we get later on into the Middle Ages, he's going to be a saint that artists are particularly going to look to. Now, this is an important icon here, this icon of Christ, done in the 6th century, and it can be found in Constantinople, or it has, of course, been renamed back to Istanbul. It's Istanbul now. There's this high degree of realism. Jesus himself kind of finally has that mature iconic depiction that we're all used to. Well, let's go back. These icons, as you can see, they display all those different things that I was just talking about. Look at all that gold. All that you see that looks super shiny like gold, looks super shiny like gold because it is gold. It is gold leaf that would have been used in these. You see the very flat sense of space, right? It's as if these individuals are just like slapped up against the wall that's behind them, right? If that's even a wall. There's just gold back there, right? You see the elongated proportions. Look at those long, skinny fingers. And then look at that face. That's that Byzantine face I was talking about, right? Not even Jesus here in the middle completely gets away with it, or without it, rather. So this is Mary here. This is, I believe, the Archangel Michael, I believe. And this is Christ in the middle. But look at their faces. All their faces essentially look the same, right? All three of them. Jesus just gets a beard, right? Again, they are just distinguished from one another by what they wear, by the symbols that they hold, by the colors that are surrounding them, things like that. Mary over here, interestingly, has little baby Jesus who looks like just a little tiny grown man. That is also something that you're going to see a lot in the Middle Ages. And even to a certain extent into the Renaissance, though that's kind of where it finally starts to go away, is that the artists just seem to be very reluctant to portray baby Jesus as a little baby. He usually looks like a grown man who's just been shrunk down to baby size, right? Yes, we'll see some pretty funny examples in some cases. But now we get to this piece, which is really early on, interestingly. And Jesus is given a much more naturalistic look about him. Now, he still has those elongated features, right? He's stretched. His hands are stretched. His face is stretched. The space beyond him is somewhat flattened, but there's still a little bit of a look like are these buildings back here? Are they going off into the distance, right? It feels like this is early on, before the Byzantine Empire really strictly enforces the anti-naturalistic way of making art. Now, something I want to tell you real quick, because it happened last year in this class, and it irked me. So I mentioned that, right, that icons are still being created to this day. Icons are still being created and still being used in some of the Eastern churches. So last year, on the exam that covered the Middle Ages, I had a question where one of the things that you could choose to write about was the icon of Christ. Right? I'm not going to dive into what the question was in whole, but one of the things you could choose from was this icon of Christ, right? Well, we were in the classroom. This is in the days before Corona, And it was also before Professor McIntosh and I realized that we also apparently needed to take smartwatches away before an exam because we had a good number of people. I won't go into the actual number, but a good number of people who clearly had used some sort of iWatch or smartwatch, and all they did was Google icon of Christ, right? So what did they write into their essays? And it was, like I said, it was a good number of them. It's not like it was just one person who did this. I was reading it and I was like, what is with this? What are they even talking about? Because they were writing about how certain icons, like the icons that come from this particular company in Greece, have attracted many people over the years. And it went on to sort of talk about and explain how inexpensive these icons were and how master artisans work on these things and they're done to your specifications. Like, what in the hell is this? And when I typed the words icon of Christ into Google, damn if the very first result in Google wasn't a website for a company in Greece that makes icons that was trying to sell you icons. And that was what the person wrote about. Don't do that crap, please. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir. I'm probably talking to the people who are not even going to think about doing such a thing, right? The people who might possibly do that may not even see me mentioning this, but there's a nice little stupid story for you. There was no need to take any notes during any of that. As I said, this style continued for centuries, and it remained fairly unchanged. I mean, here's a piece that's done in the 1400s by actually someone we have a name for, Andrei Rublev, who is essentially, I mean, like, there's some changes. There have been some changes, right? There's at least a little bit of a sense of depth of space, right? But there's still that generic Byzantine face. There's still all that gold leaf. There's still these elongated figures, right? It continued very, very much almost unchanged for a millennium, very nearly a millennium. The architecture of Byzantium will specifically look at Hagia Sophia. I struggle a little bit with saying that. Here's why. When I was in undergrad, like yourselves, had a teacher who referred to this church over and over again as Hagia Sophia. The church is actually called Hagia Sophia. But my brain will every now and then try to go back and say Hagia. It's Hagia Sophia. And we're going to specifically talk about the innovation demonstrated by this church of dome and pendentive construction, right? So dome and pendentive construction. Pendentives. What are pendentives? They are, let me get my laser pointer going, these inverted triangular structures. Inverted meaning they point downward, right? The wide parts at the top. That permits placement of a dome over a square space, right? So rather than a dome over a drum, we can build a square space, and we can use these Roman arches in between to create pendentives that take the weight of that dome and transport it down to an increasingly tapered inward point where the weight then presses down. The wide portion of the triangle up in here takes the weight and transfers it down. That's dome and pendentive construction. And it allows for something like Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia is a gorgeous church. It was built over a 5-year period from 532 to 537. It once the Ottoman Empire took over and there was a Muslim influence came into the region, it was converted into a mosque. Hence these turrets that are now on the front of it. But the original portion is all this back here, right? And Hagia Sophia is built up of many domes atop pendentives. So the interior, we can see that one really large central dome there at the top. But those pendentives, right, these triangular portions that come downward, allowing the whole thing to be built upon a square platform, also allows for other like half domes to be built outward. And so there's dome and then another half dome and another half dome, right? There are domes all around the church. Does this photograph show us that? Not very well on this one. Now it's just a historical landmark. It's not really used as a Christian or as a Muslim place of worship. But you can see down here the Arabic symbols that have been added to it. And up here you can see a lot of Christian iconography, these angels and holy figures up here that have been slowly uncovered over the years, because a lot of that stuff got covered up when this was converted into a mosque. So there's no telling how much art has still yet to be discovered because it got covered up.